Mike was the kind of man who found comfort in the solitude of the road. With over 20 years of experience as a truck driver, he had seen it all: storms that seemed to tear the sky apart, wild animals venturing onto deserted highways, and even accidents that would have made any other driver quit the wheel for good. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to encounter on a night that began like any other. It was a Thursday, and Mike had just received a call from his company's dispatcher, informing him that there was an urgent load to be delivered to a small town in the interior of the country. He knew the job would pay well, and as always, he accepted without question. The destination was a town called Coldwater, an isolated village located hundreds of kilometers from the main highway. Mike had driven through remote areas before, but never through Coldwater. However, this didn't worry him. He always believed that the road was his best companion, and that any route was just another stretch to be conquered. After loading the truck with various goods, he left the city around 7 p.m. The first part of the trip was smooth, as expected. Traffic was light, which was a relief after hours of driving through urban chaos. The city lights began to disappear on the horizon, giving way to a dark sky dotted with stars. The road seemed to stretch infinitely ahead of him, a straight line cutting through the vast plains that extended as far as the eye could see. Mike enjoyed the silence, tuning the radio to his favorite station, one that played classic rock. The familiar melodies of bands from the 70s and 80s filled the cabin, keeping him alert as the night sky grew darker. He drove at a steady pace, the truck's headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. As the hours passed, the landscape around him began to change. The open plains were replaced by dense forests that seemed to embrace the road on both sides. The tall trees formed a kind of natural tunnel, and the moonlight barely managed to penetrate through the leaves. The road became narrower and more winding, forcing Mike to slow down. As he drove through this isolated stretch, he noticed something strange. The radio began to fail, emitting static between songs. Mike adjusted the dial, trying to find a station that wasn't interfered with, but to no avail. He found it odd but didn't give it much thought. He was used to areas with no signal and decided that the silence would help him focus on the road. Shortly after, he spotted a road sign on the roadside. It was rusty and almost illegible, but Mike managed to make out the words Coldwater 100 kilometers. He knew he was getting closer to his destination, but also that the next 100 kilometers would be the most challenging. The road ahead was known to be lightly trafficked and full of dangerous curves, with few exits and almost no gas stations. It was then that he noticed something unusual. As he passed by a small truck stop, he saw that it was completely deserted. No other trucks or cars parked, no lights on. Just the wind whistling through the trees and the creaking of an old sign hanging at the entrance. Mike decided to stop to stretch his legs and check the truck. After all, the journey was still long, and he wanted to ensure everything was in order. As he stepped out of the cab, he felt a chill run down his spine. The air was unusually cold for that time of year, almost freezing. He pulled his jacket tighter around his body and began to walk around the truck, checking the tires and engine. Everything seemed normal, but there was something in the atmosphere that made him uneasy. The silence was oppressive, and Mike had the uncomfortable feeling that he was being watched. Suddenly, he heard a sound behind him, like footsteps on dry leaves. He turned quickly but saw nothing. Just thick darkness and motionless trees. He thought about calling out to see if someone was there, but held back. Maybe it's just my imagination, he murmured to himself, trying to calm down. As he was about to get back into the cab, a hoarse, low voice called out from behind him. Mike turned around and saw an old man, dressed in worn-out clothes and with a troubled look. The old man stood a few meters away, watching him with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. "Are you heading to Coldwater?" the old man asked, his voice carrying a strange seriousness. Mike hesitated before answering. "Yes, I have a delivery to make there." "Why?" The old man slowly shook his head, as if he had expected that answer. "I'd suggest you don't go any further, especially after midnight. Terrible things happen on that road, things you wouldn't understand." Mike frowned. He had heard many stories of haunted roads and cursed places, but he never believed any of it. "I've driven a lot of roads, sir. Nothing's going to stop me from making this delivery." The old man shrugged, as if knowing that his words wouldn't make a difference. "I'm just warning you. After midnight, the road changes. You might not come back the same way you entered." With that, the old man walked away, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared. Mike stood still for a moment, feeling a strange mix of disbelief and unease. He decided to ignore the warning and got back into the cab. He started the engine and continued his journey, trying to push what had just happened out of his mind. As he drove on, the clock on the dashboard read 11:45 p.m. Mike knew he was about an hour from Coldwater, and the road ahead seemed increasingly narrow and sinister. He tried not to think about the old man's warning, but something in the back of his mind was disturbing him. Something told him the night was far from over. The road ahead of Mike seemed endless, a narrow, winding path cutting through the darkness of the night. The dense trees on both sides of the road crowded together, creating a kind of natural tunnel, blocking almost all of the moonlight. The only source of light was the beam from the truck's headlights, which barely penetrated the fog that began to form as he drove on. The clock on the dashboard showed 11:55 p.m., and the old man's words at the truck stop echoed in Mike's mind. After midnight, the road changes. He tried to shake off the discomfort he felt, but it was as if something invisible was closing in around him, an oppressive presence that he couldn't explain. The radio, which had been tuned to a local country music station, began to crackle with static. Mike turned the knob, trying to find another signal, but all he heard were fragments of voices and songs interrupted by sharp noises. Frustrated, he turned off the radio, preferring silence over the disturbing sound of static. The only sound left was the constant rumble of the truck's engine and the faint hum of the tires on the asphalt. As the minutes passed, the fog around him grew denser, almost palpable. It was as if the road was being swallowed by a cloud of darkness, and Mike had to slow down to avoid veering off the track. He could barely see a few meters ahead, and road signs were becoming increasingly rare and hard to distinguish. What had once been a paved road now felt much older, almost primitive, with cracks and potholes that made the truck shake and creak. It was then that he noticed something that made him freeze. In the distance, on the side of the road, he saw a figure. At first, it looked like just a shadow in the middle of the fog, but as the truck drew closer, the figure began to take shape. It was a person, or at least it seemed to be. The figure stood motionless, staring directly at the approaching truck as if waiting for it. Mike slowed down even further, unsure of what to do. The figure was now clearly visible. It was a man, pale in appearance, with dark clothes that seemed wet. The man's face was partially covered by a scraggly beard, and his eyes had a strange, almost inhuman glow that reflected the headlights. Despite the instinct to keep going, Mike felt something compelling him to stop. He didn't know if it was curiosity or a sense of obligation, but something inside him made him pull the truck over to the side of the road. The man didn't move, just continued to stare at Mike, as if he recognized him from somewhere. Mike rolled down the cab window, the cold night air rushing in immediately. "Do you need help?" he asked, his voice sounding weaker than he intended. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if evaluating Mike. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and raspy, almost a whisper. "You're headed to Coldwater, aren't you?" Mike felt a shiver run down his spine. How did this man know? "Yes, I am. Do you need a ride?" The man gave a slight smile, but it was a smile that offered no comfort. "I'll take it, if you don't mind." Against his better judgment, Mike opened the passenger door. The man climbed into the cab slowly, as if every movement was heavy and painful. He sat next to Mike, closing the door with a dull thud that seemed to echo inside the cab. As soon as the man got in, the air inside the truck seemed to grow even colder, as if his presence was draining the warmth from the environment. Mike looked at the man, trying to start a conversation, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. Something about this man made him deeply uncomfortable, a feeling he couldn't shake. "What were you doing on the road at this hour?" Mike finally asked, trying to sound casual. The man looked straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the road disappearing into the darkness. "I was waiting for you," he replied calmly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Mike felt a knot form in his stomach. "Waiting for me? What do you mean?" The man turned to Mike, his eyes glowing with an intensity that made Mike look away involuntarily. "There are things on the Coldwater Road that aren't what they seem. Things that live in the fog, waiting for unsuspecting travelers. I don't understand. What are you talking about?" Mike was beginning to regret stopping for the stranger. "You'll understand soon," the man said, his voice now sounding darker. "This road doesn't just lead to Coldwater. It leads to much worse places." Mike felt a rising panic. He tried to focus on the road, but what the man had said was unsettling him. Who was this man? How did he know so much about the road? And why was he there, waiting? As these thoughts swirled in his mind, something even more disturbing happened. The fog around the truck began to move, as if it had a life of its own. The shadows in the trees seemed to stretch toward the road, and the darkness that surrounded them seemed to close in even more. Mike stepped on the accelerator, desperate to get out of there. The truck roared and sped down the winding road, but no matter how fast he went, the feeling of being followed and watched didn't diminish. The man beside him said nothing more, just observed, as if he knew there was no escape. As the clock on the dashboard struck midnight, the road seemed to change shape. The trees were now grotesque shadows, deformed by the darkness, and the road that once seemed familiar now felt like a trail lost in another world. Mike knew something was terribly wrong, but there was no turning back. He was trapped on that road, with a passenger he was beginning to suspect wasn't made of flesh and blood. Mike's truck rumbled slowly along the increasingly inhospitable road, as the fog around them thickened, becoming almost impenetrable. The oppressive feeling surrounding him grew with every kilometer traveled. The silence inside the cab was deafening, and Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was lurking, hidden in the shadows dancing in the darkness. The mysterious man beside him remained still, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if waiting for something that Mike couldn't understand. As the minutes passed, the road began to change shape in subtle but unsettling ways. The once gentle curves became sharper, and Mike had to focus to keep the truck on the track. The trees lining the road, once tall and imposing, now seemed to twist unnaturally, as if they were alive, trying to reach the moving vehicle. The darkness around them seemed to vibrate, as if the night itself was conspiring against him. Then, without warning, the road opened into a clearing, revealing a narrow, rusted bridge that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Mike slowed down, his eyes fixed on the structure ahead. The bridge looked old, with rotting wooden planks and dangling cables swaying gently in the wind. The river below wasn't visible, covered by the thick fog, but the sound of running water was muffled and distant, as if it were miles away. "You have to cross," said the man beside him, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "There's no other way." Mike hesitated, his instincts telling him not to trust the bridge ahead. He looked at the man, trying to discern some emotion on his pale face, but the stranger's eyes were inscrutable, cold, and lifeless. "That bridge looks like it could collapse at any moment," Mike said, his voice betraying the growing nervousness. The man simply nodded, as if he already knew that. "It always looks that way. But it's the only way." Mike took a deep breath, trying to control the fear that was taking root in his chest. He knew he had no other choice. Carefully, he put the truck in low gear and began to cross the bridge. With each meter advanced, the sound of the planks creaking under the vehicle's weight echoed into the night, a sound that seemed louder than anything else around them. Mike gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the narrow road ahead, trying to ignore what seemed to be movements in the shadows around the bridge. When he was almost halfway across the bridge, something even more disturbing happened. The truck began to vibrate slightly, as if an invisible force was trying to push it off course. Mike tried to maintain control, but the feeling that the truck was being pulled by something was growing. He looked in the rearview mirror and, to his horror, saw that the fog was moving, swirling in spirals behind the vehicle, forming figures that shouldn't exist. "Don't stop," said the man, his voice firm. "If you stop, they'll get you." Who are they?" Mike managed to ask, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer immediately. He just looked ahead, as if he was seeing something that Mike couldn't. "They are the shadows of the road. Those who got lost here and never made it out." Mike's panic increased. He stepped on the gas, trying to get across the bridge as quickly as possible. The truck roared in protest, but obeyed, moving across the ancient structure. When he finally reached the other side, Mike felt a brief wave of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of impending danger. The road unfolding before him was no longer the same as before. The trees around him were now completely twisted, their branches reaching out like claws toward the truck. The headlights, which once cut through the darkness, now seemed to be absorbed by the fog, making it almost impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. And then, the sounds began. At first, it was a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, like the wind blowing through the trees. But as they drove on, the whispers turned into distinct voices, words that Mike couldn't understand but felt deep in his soul. They were voices of despair, of agony, as if the souls of those lost on the road were trying to communicate, trying to warn him, or perhaps condemn him. Mike gripped the steering wheel even tighter, trying to push the voices out of his mind. "This isn't real," he kept repeating to himself. "It's just my imagination." But every time he looked at the man beside him, he knew it was real, that something evil was trying to take hold of him. Suddenly, the truck's lights flickered and went out for a second, plunging everything into total darkness. When they came back on, Mike saw something that almost made his heart stop. In the middle of the road stood a figure, a dark and indistinct shadow, but undeniably human. He didn't have time to swerve. The truck passed through the figure, but there was no impact. The figure vanished like smoke, but the intense cold that accompanied it remained, invading the cab and enveloping Mike in a frozen terror. "You can't escape them," the man beside him finally broke the silence. "They are part of this road, and now you are too." Mike tried to process what the man was saying, but everything around him seemed to conspire against him. The road, once long and deserted, now seemed full of invisible presences, shadows that moved in the corners of his vision, disappearing whenever he tried to focus on them. The voices grew louder, more insistent, more desperate, and Mike felt as if he was on the brink of madness. The clock on the dashboard read 12:30. Midnight had passed, and Mike knew, deep in his soul, that the road had truly changed. He was in a place that wasn't of this world, a road where reality and nightmare intertwined in a way he couldn't comprehend. He looked again at the man, desperately seeking some explanation, some way out, but the man just gave him a slight smile, a smile that offered no comfort. "There's no escape, Mike. The road won't let you go." That statement hung in the air, heavy as lead. Mike knew the man was right, but he refused to give up. He had to get out of there, he had to survive. He stepped on the accelerator again, forcing the truck to move forward, but every kilometer he traveled seemed only to take him deeper into the nightmare. And then, he saw it again. In the rearview mirror, something was following the truck. It wasn't a vehicle, nor a person, but a shadow moving fast, almost floating over the road. It was getting closer, merging with the fog, and Mike knew that if it caught up to him, it would be the end. "Faster, you have to go faster," he told himself, but the truck was already at its limit. The road's curves were getting tighter, and each maneuver required all his skill to avoid an accident. The fear of going off the road and falling into an unknown abyss was as great as the fear of what was following him. The truck's lights flickered again, and this time, when they went out, Mike heard a terrible sound. A scream, loud and high-pitched, that seemed to come from all directions at once. A scream that wasn't human, but full of indescribable agony. The scream echoed in his ears, making him almost lose control of the truck. And then, the silence returned, as sudden as the scream had begun. Mike was sweating, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. He knew he was near his breaking point, that if anything else happened, He might not be able to continue. But he had no choice. He had to keep driving. He had to get off this cursed road. But deep down, Mike knew the worst was yet to come. The truck rumbled heavily along the distorted road, as if fighting against an invisible force trying to stop it from moving forward. Sweat dripped down Mike's forehead, and his hands were clenched around the steering wheel, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. He knew he was trapped in something beyond his understanding, something that shouldn't exist but was now a part of his reality. The man beside him, who had been so enigmatic from the start, was strangely silent. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared straight ahead at the road. Mike couldn't shake the feeling that the man knew far more than he was letting on, and his silence only added to the growing dread that spread through Mike's mind. When Mike finally found the courage to speak, his voice came out hoarse, laden with fear. "What's happening here? What do you know about this road?" The man slowly turned his head toward Mike, his dark eyes gleaming in the dim light of the dashboard. "Have you ever heard of the legend of Coldwater, Mike?" he asked, his tone almost like he was reciting an ancient tale. Mike shook his head, his curiosity momentarily outweighing his fear. "No. I've never heard of it." The man sighed, as if he had expected that answer. "The road we're traveling on isn't just an ordinary road. It's a path between the world of the living and something else. Many years ago, there was a terrible accident here. A truck carrying fuel went off the road and exploded, killing the driver instantly. But the legend says that he didn't die alone. Other lost souls were already wandering this road, and with the explosion, something was released, something ancient and hungry." Mike felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but the man's words echoed in his mind. "Something was released? What are you talking about?" The man continued, his voice low and filled with gravity. "The explosion opened a portal, a connection between this world and another place, a place of darkness. Since then, this road has drawn in those who are alone, those who are lost in their own lives, like you, Mike. It lures them in and traps them, and few manage to escape." Mike felt a wave of panic. "And why are you here? Are you part of this?" The man smiled, but it was a sad, almost resigned smile. "I'm one of those who didn't manage to escape, Mike. I traveled this road just as you are doing now. I was drawn to it, and before I realized it, I was trapped. My life, or what was left of it, was consumed by this road. Now, I'm here, trapped between two worlds, trying to warn those who come after me." Mike felt the blood freeze in his veins. He looked at the man, trying to find some evidence that he was lying, but all he saw was truth in his eyes. "You're a ghost?" The word felt ridiculous as it left his mouth, but deep down, he knew it was the only explanation. The man nodded slowly. "Yes. I'm what's left of a soul that once traveled this road. And now I'm here, trying to stop others from suffering the same fate." Mike didn't know what to say. His mind struggled to accept what was happening, but everything around him told him it was real. The road ahead, the shadows moving around, the voices whispering in his ears, all were proof that he had entered a place that defied logic and reason. "So, how do I get out of here?" Mike asked, his voice trembling with desperation. The man looked at him with an expression of deep sadness. "I don't know. I never found a way out. But there's a chance, a small chance that you might. The road is a living entity, hungry for souls. It will try to trick you, deceive you, but if you can keep your sanity and not give in to fear, maybe, just maybe, you can find a way out." Mike felt despair tighten around his chest. How could he keep his sanity in a place like this? How could he resist the fear when everything around him was steeped in terror? But he knew he had no choice. If he wanted to survive, he had to try. As he drove, the man's words began to resonate in his mind. He started to realize that the road wasn't just a physical path, but also a reflection of his own mental state. The fog, the shadows, the voices, all seemed to intensify the more he gave in to fear. If he wanted to escape, he would need to find a way to control his emotions, to not succumb to the terror that surrounded him. But that was easier said than done. The road seemed alive, pulsing around him as if it were responding to his thoughts and emotions. And the man beside him, the ghost who had once been a truck driver like him, seemed to know exactly what was coming. "You need to prepare yourself, Mike," the man said, his voice gaining an urgency that hadn't been there before. "The road is going to test you. It will bring out your deepest fears, your greatest weaknesses. And if you give in, it will take you forever." Mike didn't respond. He was trying to mentally prepare for what was to come, but the truth was, he didn't know if he could. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally, and the weight of what he had discovered was beginning to crush him. Suddenly, the road ahead began to open into a clearing, but this was no ordinary clearing. It was a vast, empty space surrounded by trees that looked like dark towers, with twisted branches like claws. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone structure, half in ruins but still imposing. It looked like an old sanctuary or perhaps a forgotten church, something that shouldn't be there. "What is this?" Mike asked, his voice filled with apprehension. The man looked at the structure with an expression that Mike couldn't decipher. "This is the heart of the road, the place where it all began. If you can make it through, you might find the exit. But if you fail, it will be the end." Mike stopped the truck at the entrance to the clearing. The engine rumbled low, as if the machine itself was aware of the danger ahead. He looked at the man, hoping for more instructions, but the ghost simply stared at him, his dark eyes filled with infinite sadness. "I can't go with you," the man finally said. "My journey ends here. But you still have a chance. Remember, Mike, don't give in to fear. The road feeds on it." Before Mike could respond, the man disappeared, dissolving into a thin mist that was quickly swallowed by the surrounding darkness. Mike was left alone in the truck's cab, the silence weighing on him like a ton of bricks. He knew he had to keep going, but the idea of entering that structure terrified him. Yet he also knew he had no choice. If he wanted to leave this cursed road alive, he would have to face whatever was waiting for him inside. With a final breath of determination, Mike turned off the truck's engine and stepped out of the cab. The clearing was silent, but it wasn't a peaceful silence, it was a silence heavy with expectation, as if the very night was holding its breath, waiting for his next move. He walked toward the structure, each step heavier than the last. The road had led him there, and now, all he could do was keep moving forward, hoping there was an exit at the end of the path. Mike stood in front of the ancient structure, feeling the weight of the silence around him. The road had brought him here, and he knew that somehow this place was crucial to his survival. But the idea of entering those ruins terrified him. Something about the building felt wrong, as if the very structure was steeped in evil, waiting to devour anyone who dared to enter. He took a hesitant step toward the entrance, which looked more like a black gash in the stone facade, like an open mouth ready to swallow whatever came its way. The air around him was thick, almost tangible, and each breath felt like an effort. As he approached, the wind picked up out of nowhere, whistling through the trees and sending dead leaves swirling around his feet. Mike felt the urge to turn back to the truck and flee, but he knew he had nowhere to go. The road had brought him here, and he needed to find out why. With his heart pounding, Mike crossed the threshold of the structure. The interior was engulfed in darkness, except for a faint glow coming from what seemed to be the altar at the far end of the main hall. The stone walls were covered in moss and ancient inscriptions, symbols he didn't recognize but that sent a chill down his spine. The smell of dampness and decay permeated the air, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the empty space, creating a sinister soundtrack for his journey. Every step Mike took seemed to echo endlessly, as if the sound was being amplified by something beyond the walls. He felt like he was being watched, that the eyes of the shadows were fixed on him, scrutinizing his every move. The sensation of being followed, which had begun on the road, was now stronger than ever. He knew that something was there with him, something that wasn't of this world. When he finally reached the altar, Mike realized that the light he had seen was coming from a small candle, burned down almost to the end, flickering on the edge of an ancient chalice. The chalice was filled with a dark, thick liquid that seemed to absorb the little light around it. Mike hesitated, feeling a wave of nausea and fear as he looked at the liquid, instinctively sensing that it was something dangerous, something that shouldn't be touched. "That is the essence of the road," a voice whispered deep in his mind. Mike turned quickly, expecting to see the ghostly man, but there was no one. The whisper, however, continued, echoing in his mind. "The road feeds on the despair and fear of those who travel it. It lures them, devours them, and keeps them here, eternally trapped between two worlds." Mike tried to push the voice away, but it felt as if it were rooted in his very thoughts. He didn't know if he was beginning to lose his mind or if the road was truly communicating with him. The idea that the very path he traveled was a living entity, hungry for his soul, terrified him. But he knew he had to continue. Somehow, he felt that he needed to confront the essence of this road if he wanted to survive. As he approached the chalice, he felt an invisible resistance, as if the very air was trying to push him back. The temperature around him dropped drastically, and Mike saw his own breath form small clouds of vapor. He reached out to grab the candle, but the moment his fingers touched the cold metal, a wave of pain shot through his arm, making him scream and recoil. He looked at his hand and saw a red mark, as if it had been burned. But there was no fire, only the chalice, which now seemed to pulse with a faint light, almost like a beating heart. Mike stepped back, his fear growing by the second. He felt as though he was on the brink of something terrible, something that could consume him completely. Then, the darkness around him began to move. The shadows on the walls started to stir, separating from the surfaces and taking on vaguely human forms. They had no faces, just indistinct outlines, as if made of pure darkness. The figures moved closer, slowly surrounding Mike, blocking any escape routes. Panic overtook Mike. He tried to back away, but the shadows were everywhere. Their voices, a unified and ominous whisper, began to fill the air. "You cannot escape. The road is inside you now. It will devour you, just as it did to all the others." Mike's heart raced. He looked around frantically, searching for a way out, but the only thing he saw was the altar and the chalice. He knew he had to do something, but what? The shadows were closing in, and the cold they emanated seemed to drain his energy, his will to fight. In a desperate act, Mike lunged at the chalice again. He felt the pain shoot through his arm once more, but this time he didn't pull back. With all his strength, he grabbed the candle from the chalice and, in a swift motion, tipped the chalice over, spilling its contents onto the stone floor. The thick liquid spread out, and as it did, the shadows recoiled, screaming in agony. The scream of the shadows was deafening, a sound that seemed to vibrate through Mike's bones. He fell to his knees, trying to cover his ears, but the sound was inside his mind, not outside. The shadows began to dissipate, like mist under the sun, but not before leaving their mark on Mike's psyche. When the scream finally ceased, silence returned to the place, but it was a silence heavy with something more. Mike was panting, exhausted, and terrified. He looked around, expecting the shadows to return, but they were gone, at least for now. The chalice was now empty, the candle had gone out, and the room was plunged into absolute darkness. Mike knew he wasn't safe yet. The road still held him captive, and he needed to find a way out. With trembling legs, he got to his feet and turned to leave the building. But when he looked at the entrance, he saw something that made him freeze in fear. The door through which he had entered was closed, and in front of it stood a figure. It was tall, slender, and its face was obscured by shadow, but Mike knew it wasn't the man who had accompanied him before. This figure was something completely different, something that exuded pure and uncontrollable malice. "You have disturbed the balance," the figure said, its voice a cold whisper that sent shivers down Mike's spine. "Now, you must pay the price." Mike felt the panic rising, but something inside him refused to give up. He had come too far to be defeated now. "I'm getting out of here," he said, his voice firm despite the fear. "I won't be another victim of this road." The figure laughed, a dry, joyless sound. "You think you can leave? No one leaves, Mike. No one ever has." The darkness around him seemed to intensify, as if it were closing in on him. Mike knew he was in a fight for his life, perhaps for his very soul. He didn't know how, but he had to fight, had to find a way out before it was too late. With one last look at the figure, Mike turned and ran toward the opposite entrance of the building. He didn't know what awaited him on the other side, but anything was better than facing what stood before him. He pushed the door open with all his strength and stepped out into the cold night, his heart pounding in his chest. Outside, the road awaited him, silent and unforgiving. The fog was still there, dense and oppressive, but there was a clearing ahead, a small opening in the darkness. Mike knew it was his only chance. He ran toward the truck, the only refuge he had on that cursed road. Climbing into the cab, he started the engine, which roared back to life as if it was as desperate to escape as he was. With a sharp movement, Mike shifted gears and sped down the road that unfolded before him. He knew the fight was far from over, but for now, he had bought himself a little more time. But as he drove, a voice whispered deep in his mind, a voice he couldn't ignore. "The road is inside you, Mike. It always will be." And with that, he knew that the battle wasn't just against the road, but against himself. The despair he felt was his greatest enemy, and if he wanted to survive, he would have to defeat it. The road wasn't done with him yet, but Mike wasn't done with the road either. The truck moved forward along the road, but Mike felt as though the very fabric of reality around him was unraveling. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light, it was a living, pulsating presence that seemed to be closing in, trying to envelop the truck like a predator stalking its prey. The headlights struggled to penetrate the dense fog, and the sound of the engine was the only thing keeping Mike tethered to the physical world. Each mile he drove seemed to stretch on infinitely. The curves in the road, once familiar, now appeared distorted, shifting before his eyes. Trees he was certain he had passed earlier reappeared like spectral shadows, their twisted branches resembling claws that seemed ready to grab hold of him. The road had transformed into an endless labyrinth, a constantly shifting prison designed to break the mind of anyone who dared to traverse it. As he drove, the voice in his mind, the one he had heard in the sanctuary, returned, louder and more insistent. "You can't escape, Mike. The road is part of you now. It feels your fear, your despair. And the more you fight, the stronger it becomes." Mike tried to push the voice away, but it felt as if it were embedded in his thoughts, a parasite feeding on his emotions. He refused to give in to panic, but the weight of the situation was beginning to take its toll. His hands trembled on the wheel, and he could feel sweat dripping down his forehead, despite the intense cold permeating the cab. "I won't give in," he murmured to himself, a desperate attempt to convince himself. "I won't let this damn road defeat me." But the road seemed to hear his words. Suddenly, the truck's radio, which had been silent since the journey began, burst to life, emitting a loud, screeching static that made Mike jump in shock. He tried to turn it off, but the button wouldn't respond. The static began to shift into something else, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, in languages he didn't recognize but that carried with them a profound sense of horror. "You're lost, Mike," one of the voices said, cold and indifferent. "Everyone who comes down this road is lost. They never find their way back because the road has no end. It feeds on their souls, their fears, until there's nothing left." Another voice, lower and more sinister, whispered next. "You think you're different, that you can escape? No one escapes, Mike. They all think they can, but they all fail. They all become part of the road, forever trapped in the fog, screaming for a salvation that never comes." Mike squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, more insistent. He knew he was in a battle for his sanity as much as for his life. The road was trying to break him, to make him give up, and he could feel it getting harder to resist. Then he saw something ahead that made him catch his breath. In the middle of the road, shrouded in fog, was a familiar figure. It was the ghostly man, the passenger who had disappeared in the building. But now he seemed different. The figure was more solid, more defined, as if he was materializing back into reality. Mike brought the truck to an abrupt stop, the engine growling in protest. He looked at the man through the windshield, trying to make sense of what was happening. The man began to walk toward the truck, his expression neutral, but his eyes filled with a strange intensity. When he reached the side of the truck, the passenger door opened on its own, as if an invisible force was pulling it. The man climbed in, sitting in the seat next to Mike as if nothing had happened. "You're not understanding, Mike," the man said, his voice low and filled with deep sadness. "The road doesn't just want your life. It wants your soul, your essence. It feeds on your weaknesses, your fears, and it grows stronger because of them. I'm proof of that. I was broken by this road, and now I'm trapped here, like so many others before me." Mike looked at the man, feeling a mix of fear and anger. "So why did you come back? To tell me I'm doomed? To make me give up?" The man shook his head slowly. "I came back because there's something you need to understand. The road is a living force, but it's not invincible. It can be deceived, defeated. But that can only happen if you confront what it truly is." "How?" Mike asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do I confront a road?" The man looked out at the road ahead, his eyes fixed on the darkness that stretched beyond the fog. "The road is a reflection of your mind, of your deepest fears. It distorts reality to break your will. But if you can control those fears, if you can confront them and overcome them, you can weaken the road. You can find a way back." Mike felt a spark of hope, but it was quickly smothered by the terror he felt. "And if I fail? What happens if I can't do it?" The man turned his gaze back to Mike, his dark eyes reflecting a terrible truth. "Then you'll become part of it, just like I did. You'll be trapped here, your soul devoured by the fog, your existence diluted until you're nothing but a whisper in the darkness." Mike swallowed hard. He knew he was at a point of no return. Either he faced the road and his own fears, or he would be consumed by it forever. Suddenly, the road ahead began to change again. The fog lifted slightly, revealing something Mike hadn't expected to see. It was a town, or at least what was left of one. The streets were deserted, the houses in ruins, but there was something profoundly disturbing about the sight. It was as if the town was trapped in a time loop, always on the brink of destruction but never fully destroyed. "What is this?" Mike asked, his heart pounding faster. "This is the heart of the road," the man replied, his tone serious. "The town of Coldwater. This is where it all began. And this is where it all ends." Mike felt a wave of dread as he approached the town. He knew he was about to face the greatest challenge of his life, something that could cost him more than just his life. As he entered the town, the feeling of being watched returned in full force. The windows of the houses seemed to be filled with shadows, indistinct figures that watched him with eyes he couldn't see. The streets were empty, but the air was thick with a malevolent energy, as if something was lurking, waiting to strike. Mike knew he couldn't turn back now. He drove slowly down what seemed to be the main street, observing the details of the ruined town. There were abandoned cars, broken streetlights, and on every surface, a thick layer of dust and soot. But what really unsettled him were the markings on the walls, symbols etched into the stone, like scars left by something inhuman. "This town was sacrificed," the man said, breaking the silence. "It was offered to the road, a trade to maintain the connection between the worlds. Everyone who lived here was taken by the road, their souls devoured. And since then, Coldwater has become part of it, a portal to eternal despair." Mike felt his stomach turn. He wanted to leave, to run away to anywhere else, but he knew he had nowhere to go. The road had brought him here for a reason, and he knew there was only one way to end this. He parked the truck in front of what looked like the town's main building, perhaps an old town hall or community center. The structure was partially collapsed, but it still held an air of authority, as if it was waiting for visitors who would never come. "This is it," the man said, pointing to the building. "If you want to end this, this is where you need to go. This is where the bond between worlds is strongest. But be careful, Mike. The road won't let you destroy what it has built." Mike felt intense fear, but he knew he had no choice. He stepped out of the truck, feeling the cold air, and began walking toward the building. Each step seemed more difficult than the last, as if an invisible force was trying to stop him. When he reached the door, he paused, took a deep breath, and pushed it open. The door creaked, revealing the building's interior, shrouded in deep shadows. Mike entered, feeling the heavy air, filled with a pungent smell, like that of old, forgotten things. The interior was almost completely dark, except for a faint light coming from somewhere ahead. Mike followed the light, his footsteps echoing down a long corridor. The walls were covered with the same symbols he had seen outside, but here, they seemed more intense, almost alive, as if they were moving beneath the surface. When he finally reached the end of the corridor, the light intensified, revealing a large circular room. In the center of the room stood a figure, cloaked in dark fabric. Mike felt a wave of fear as he realized the figure was not alone. Other figures began to emerge from the shadows around it, all silent, all watching. "What is this?" Mike asked, his voice almost a whisper. The central figure lifted its head, revealing a pale, expressionless face. "This is the end of the road, Mike. And the beginning of a new existence. You cannot escape because you are now part of it." Mike felt despair tighten around his heart, but he knew this was his last chance. He needed to fight, needed to end the bond before it was too late. With a shout of determination, Mike charged at the central figure, determined to end this once and for all. But as he ran, the other figures moved, surrounding him, trying to stop him. The air around him grew heavier, almost impossible to breathe, but Mike pushed on, his determination overpowering his fear. When he reached the central figure, he raised his hands, ready to strike, but before he could do anything, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. He looked down and saw something he couldn't believe. His own hand was holding a blade, which had struck him. The figure in front of him smiled, a cold smile. "You can't defeat what you already are, Mike. The road is you, and you are the road." The pain was intense, but Mike didn't give up. With his last breath, he pulled the blade out and, with all the strength he had left, threw it at the figure, hitting it in the chest. The figure stopped, looking at the blade lodged in its chest, and then let out a scream that echoed through the room. The figures around him began to dissipate, like mist in the wind, and the darkness around him started to fracture. Mike fell to his knees, exhausted, but he felt that something was changing. The room around him began to collapse, the walls cracking, and light began to flood the space, driving away the shadows. He knew he had won, but the cost had been high. The road was weakened, but so was he. His vision began to darken, and he knew he was about to lose consciousness. But then, he felt something different. A gentle, comforting presence enveloped him. It wasn't the road, but something much older and more powerful, something that had come to guide him back to the world. With one final breath, Mike passed out, but this time, it was out of relief. He knew that somehow, he had succeeded. He had overcome the road. When he woke up, he was lying on the seat of his truck, the morning sun shining gently through the windshield. The road ahead was clear and calm, like any other ordinary road. Mike looked around, trying to understand what had happened, but the town, the building, everything was gone. He was alone, but free. With a sigh of relief, Mike started the truck and began to drive. He knew he would never forget what had happened, but now, he had a new chance, a new life. The road was behind him, and he was ready to move forward. When Mike regained consciousness, he felt the light morning breeze coming through the slightly open window of the truck. The sun was rising on the horizon, bathing the road in a golden light that seemed almost surreal, given the oppressive darkness he had faced moments before. The soft warmth of the sun was a welcome relief, but even so, Mike couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease within him. He was free from the road, but something still felt wrong, he knew it. With a groan, Mike straightened up in the seat, feeling the weight of exhaustion in every muscle of his body. His trembling fingers reached for the ignition, and he started the truck. The engine roared back to life, but the sound didn't bring the comfort he expected. There was something strange, like a distant echo that seemed to whisper from the depths of his mind. The road ahead looked normal, but Mike no longer trusted his perceptions. He had seen firsthand how the road could deceive him, how it could distort reality and turn even the most mundane landscapes into a living nightmare. Still, He had no choice. He needed to keep going, needed to leave that cursed road behind before it could try something else. With a deep sigh, he pressed the accelerator, and the truck began to move slowly down the road. Every meter he covered was a relief, but it also brought a new wave of anxiety. He didn't know if he had truly escaped or if the road was just waiting for the right moment to strike again. As he drove, Mike started to notice details that made him even more suspicious. The road seemed different from before, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. The trees, once twisted and sinister, now appeared ordinary, but there was a silent unease about them. It was as if nature itself was watching, waiting for something. The landscape around him blurred into greens and browns, but when Mike dared to glance in the rearview mirror, his blood ran cold. He saw something that made him question if he was truly free. In the mirror, the road behind him wasn't bathed in sunlight. Instead, it was shrouded in a dense, almost tangible darkness, like a black cloud slowly closing in. It was the same darkness he knew all too well, the same darkness that had tried to consume him the night before. "No. It can't be," Mike murmured, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He accelerated, trying to put more distance between himself and that darkness, but it seemed to always be just a few meters away, following him like a hungry shadow. He looked at the road ahead, trying to find a sign that he was nearing safety, but everything seemed infinitely far away. It was as if the road was stretching, keeping him trapped within its grasp, no matter how hard he tried to escape. That's when he realized the road wasn't trying to stop him from fleeing. It was testing him, trying to break him, waiting for him to make a mistake, to give in to panic. The road knew that if he lost control, it could pull him back, once and for all. "I won't let you take me," Mike said, almost like a mantra to himself. He knew he couldn't allow himself to fall into despair again. He had to keep his cool, had to believe there was a way out, even if he couldn't see it yet. With each kilometer he covered, the tension inside Mike grew. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and his heart pounded wildly in his chest. The road felt alive, reacting to every one of his emotions, every dark thought that crossed his mind. He knew he was being manipulated, but that didn't make it any easier. Suddenly, the truck's radio, which had been silent since the confrontation in the town, came back to life. This time, it wasn't static but a soft, almost comforting melody, like an old lullaby playing on a phonograph. The music brought back memories of Mike's childhood, of times when he felt safe and loved. He knew it was a trick, but the melody was so sweet, so soothing, that he allowed himself to relax for a brief moment. And in that moment, the road struck. Without warning, the truck began to shake violently. The steering wheel jerked hard to the right, nearly causing Mike to lose control. He fought to keep the truck on the road, but it felt as if the road was warping beneath him, shifting to throw off his balance. "No! Not now!" Mike shouted, forcing the steering wheel back to center. The truck continued to tremble, but he managed to maintain control, at least for the moment. The melody on the radio grew louder, more insistent, almost like a voice whispering in his mind. "Give up, Mike. Stop fighting. You're tired, aren't you? Just close your eyes, and all of this will end." Mike shook his head, trying to block out the voice. "I'm not giving up," he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty cab. But the road didn't relent. The ground in front of him began to crack open, fissures rapidly spreading and threatening to swallow the entire truck. Mike swerved left, then right, narrowly avoiding the cracks. With each evasive maneuver, the darkness seemed to creep closer, almost consuming the rear of the truck. Fear was beginning to take hold of him again, but he knew he couldn't give in. "Focus, Mike. Focus," he repeated to himself, forcing his thoughts to stay on the road ahead. Then, in the distance, he saw something that gave him a glimmer of hope. It was a crossroads where the main road split into two. He knew that crossroads was real, that it would lead him off the cursed road and back into the real world. But there was a problem. Between him and the crossroads, the road was filled with shadowy figures, silhouettes he recognized. They were the same figures he had seen in the town, the ones that had surrounded him in the building. They stood still, unmoving, but Mike knew they wouldn't let him pass easily. He had to decide, either face the shadows and try to cross, or risk being trapped on the road forever. But he already knew there was only one option. There was no more time to hesitate. With fierce determination, Mike accelerated toward the shadows, ignoring the fear that threatened to paralyze him. He knew he had to move fast, that he couldn't let the figures close in on him. "I won't stop. I won't stop," he shouted, his eyes locked on the crossroads ahead. The figures began to move as he approached, their distorted forms stretching out toward the truck. Mike kept his foot on the accelerator, the engine roaring in response. The figures tried to grasp him, to pull him into the darkness, but he forced the truck through them, feeling the impact as if he were breaking through an invisible barrier. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Mike felt a wave of cold sweep through his body, as if he were being pulled into the road itself. But he kept pushing forward, focused on reaching the crossroads. He knew he couldn't stop, couldn't let the road win. And then, he broke through the last of the figures and reached the crossroads. As soon as his wheels touched the asphalt of the new road, the darkness that had been chasing him seemed to retreat, as if repelled by the sunlight shining brightly ahead. The shadowy figures vanished, dissolving into the air, and the tremor in the truck ceased. Mike kept driving for a few more minutes until he finally felt safe. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw that the cursed road had disappeared, as if it had never existed. Everything around him seemed normal again, the trees, the road, the sky, everything was at peace. He stopped the truck, his hands still trembling. He let his head rest on the steering wheel, breathing deeply, trying to process what had just happened. He had done it. He had escaped. But even so, a part of him knew that the road was still out there, somewhere. It had let him go, not because it was defeated, but because he had proven himself strong enough to resist. And that was a victory he didn't take for granted. Mike started the truck again and began to drive. This time, he knew he was truly free, but he also knew that the road would stay with him forever, somewhere in his mind, a reminder that fear doesn't only lurk on deserted roads but also in the depths of the human soul. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, lighting up the new road ahead, Mike felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The sun was high in the sky by the time Mike finally left the cursed road behind. The heat, which had once felt oppressive, was now a welcome relief, a sign that he was back in the real world. The clear blue sky contrasted sharply with the suffocating darkness he had faced. But despite the peaceful surroundings, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, that the road hadn't completely let him go. The path ahead looked ordinary, but Mike knew he wasn't the same man who had started that journey. He was changed, as if the road had left an indelible mark on his soul. His hands still trembled on the wheel, and the sound of the engine, once comforting, now seemed distant, almost unreal. He forced himself to believe that he was safe, that he had escaped, but the doubt lingered in his mind. After driving for a few hours, Mike spotted a small town on the horizon. The houses and shops looked normal, with people walking the streets, going about their daily routines. Everything seemed so common, so mundane. Yet, to Mike, the sight felt surreal. He had spent so long in the darkness that the light and normalcy of the town seemed almost like a mirage, something intangible. He entered the town, driving slowly down the narrow streets. The people didn't seem to notice the truck or the troubled man driving it. To them, Mike was just another trucker, another person passing through their lives without leaving a mark. But to Mike, every face, every laugh he saw seemed to carry a hidden shadow, a reminder of the road he had just left behind. He finally parked the truck in front of a small roadside diner. The place looked inviting, with its neon sign flickering and the smell of fresh coffee wafting from inside. Mike realized he was hungry, but the thought of eating wasn't as appealing as the idea of being around normal people again, of feeling life around him. When he entered the diner, he was greeted by a warm atmosphere and the sound of a jukebox playing soft country music. The tables were occupied by truckers and locals, all chatting quietly, as if the world around them was a safe and predictable place. Mike felt like an outsider in that world of normalcy, as if he no longer belonged. He sat at a table in the corner, away from everyone's view. A middle-aged waitress with a kind smile came over to take his order. "What'll it be, hon?" she asked, her voice sweet and comforting. Mike hesitated before answering. He wanted to order something simple, something that would ground him in the reality that he felt was slipping through his fingers. "Coffee, please. And a slice of apple pie." The waitress jotted down the order and walked away, leaving Mike alone with his thoughts. He looked out the window, watching the people outside, going about their lives. But despite the calm around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He started to wonder if he had truly escaped the road or if all this was just another illusion, one last trick of the road to break him. When the waitress returned with his order, Mike nodded his thanks and began to sip the coffee, feeling the warm liquid soothe his throat. The apple pie tasted sweet and familiar, something that should have brought him back to reality, but each bite felt strange, as if he were tasting a piece of a dream, something that could evaporate at any moment. As Mike ate, he noticed that he was drawing glances from some of the people in the restaurant. Nothing hostile, but curious. Maybe they could sense the tension in his shoulders, the way he looked around as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows. He tried to ignore it, but whispers began to fill the air around him. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew they were talking about him. Or maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Finishing his coffee, Mike paid the bill and left the restaurant, feeling more uneasy than when he had entered. The daylight still shone brightly, but now it seemed blinding, as if it were trying to hide something behind its clarity. He returned to the truck, feeling exhausted but knowing he couldn't stop. Something inside him urged him to keep going, as if the road still held some power over him, something he needed to confront once and for all. As he drove through the town, Mike began to notice small details that seemed out of place. Traffic signs that appeared to be in the wrong positions, buildings that looked different than before. He passed a store he could have sworn was closed minutes ago, yet now it was open, full of customers. His eyes caught movement in the windows of houses, shadows that vanished the moment he looked directly at them. The world around him was shifting, distorting in subtle yet disturbing ways. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself, trying to convince himself that he was just tired, that his mind was playing tricks on him after everything he had been through. But the doubt kept gnawing at him. What if he was still trapped on the road? What if this entire town was just another illusion, another trick to break him? Mike finally arrived at a motel on the edge of town. He needed to rest, needed a break to clear his thoughts. The flickering motel sign seemed inviting, and he decided to spend the night there before continuing his journey. Maybe sleep would help clear his mind, dispel the remnants of the nightmare he had faced. He parked the truck and entered the small motel office. The receptionist, an older man with a tired expression, greeted him with a nod. "A room for the night?" the man asked, his voice gravelly. Mike nodded. "Yes, just one night." As the receptionist filled out the paperwork, Mike looked around, trying to get used to his surroundings. Everything seemed normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. The soft music playing in the background, the fake plants in the corners, the scent of disinfectant, everything seemed right, yet wrong at the same time, like watching a stage play where every detail was carefully placed to appear real but wasn't. When he finally entered his room, Mike collapsed onto the bed, feeling exhaustion take over his body. He closed his eyes, but the images of the road continued to haunt him. He saw the shadowy figures, the dense darkness that chased him, the ruined town. He felt his hands trembling, the fear tightening its grip on his heart. "It's over," he whispered to himself, trying to calm down. "I'm out. I'm free." But the words felt empty, lacking conviction. Mike knew the road might have let him go, but it hadn't set him free. He still carried the weight of what he had experienced, like a burden he could never truly abandon. Sleep finally came, but it didn't bring peace. Mike was tormented by vivid dreams, where he found himself back on the road, running desperately as the darkness pursued him. He saw familiar faces among the shadows, all distorted into masks of terror, all crying out for help, all being consumed by the road. And then he would wake up, cold with sweat, only to realize that the nightmare continued, that the line between dream and reality was beginning to blur. The night passed slowly, each second feeling like an eternity. Mike tried to convince himself it was just the trauma, that he needed time to heal, but a part of him knew the truth. The road had changed him, had left something inside him that couldn't be erased. And even now, in the silence of the motel room, he could hear the distant sound of tires on asphalt, as if the road was calling to him, patiently waiting for the right moment to pull him back. The next morning, Mike woke up exhausted, as if he hadn't slept at all. He looked out the window and saw that the town was shrouded in a light fog, a grim reminder of the road he had left behind. He knew he couldn't stay there, he needed to keep moving, even though he wasn't sure where he was going. As he packed his things and prepared to leave, Mike felt a presence beside him. He quickly turned around, but no one was there. Still, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. It was the road, he knew. It was still there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for him. He left the room, paid the receptionist, and got into the truck. The engine roared to life as always, but the sound now seemed more threatening, more sinister. Mike looked at the road ahead, knowing that his journey wouldn't be easy. He had escaped the road, but it was still inside him, a constant reminder that the terror he had faced wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. As he drove, the world around him began to seem more normal, more real. But Mike knew it was only a matter of time before the road came back to reclaim what it believed was its own. And he knew that when that happened, he would have to be ready to fight again because the road would never truly let him go. Days passed since Mike had left the fog-shrouded town behind. He kept driving, crossing small towns and roads that seemed ordinary, but he knew that nothing was the same anymore. What should have been a simple journey back home had turned into an endless voyage, marked by a sense of disconnection from the world around him. Every mile traveled seemed to take him further away from the normalcy he so desperately wanted. He stopped at various places along the way, gas stations, diners, motels, but none of them offered the comfort he sought. People were kind but distant, their voices echoing from a reality to which Mike no longer felt he belonged. He noticed that the social interactions that once felt natural now seemed forced, as if he were playing a role in a play he didn't fully understand. On the third night, Mike stopped in a small town by a river. The streets were almost deserted, except for a few residents hurrying by, engrossed in their own lives. He found a simple motel with a flickering neon sign and decided to spend the night there. The receptionist, an elderly man with thick-rimmed glasses, seemed friendly, but his eyes held a shadow of curiosity when they landed on Mike. It was as if he could see beyond the surface, sensing the torment Mike carried with him. "Long trip, huh?" the receptionist asked as he handed Mike the room key. Mike simply nodded, trying to avoid a conversation he knew he couldn't sustain. "Yeah, very long." "Get some rest, then," the receptionist said with an enigmatic smile. "We all need a break from time to time." Mike thanked him, but the man's words echoed in his mind as he climbed the stairs to his room. The feeling of being watched, of something being wrong, had become a constant in his life. He wondered if he would ever truly be able to rest or if the road would continue to haunt him, even in moments of supposed tranquility. The motel room was simple but clean. The bed looked inviting, but Mike couldn't shake the unease that kept him on edge. He dropped his things on the floor and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to observe the street outside. The darkness of night had fallen, and the dim streetlights cast long, distorted shadows on the sidewalks. Something about the view unsettled him, as if the shadows were subtly shifting, almost imperceptibly, but enough to keep him on alert. Unable to relax, Mike decided to take a hot shower, hoping that the water might ease the tension that had built up in his muscles. As the water cascaded over his body, he closed his eyes, trying to focus on the present, on the simple pleasure of the warmth. But even with his eyes closed, he could feel the presence of the road, like a painful memory that refused to fade away. After the shower, Mike put on clean clothes and collapsed onto the bed, hoping that exhaustion would finally take over. But, as in previous nights, sleep didn't come easily. He tossed and turned, trying to find a comfortable position, But every time he closed his eyes, images of the road returned to his mind. He saw the dark figures, the fog, the ruined town. It was as if the road had taken root in his subconscious, turning his dreams into endless nightmares. Finally, exhausted, Mike fell asleep, but the relief was brief. He found himself back on the road, driving through a darkness that seemed endless. The truck's engine roared, but the sound was muffled, as if it were underwater. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw, to his horror, that the darkness was closing in again, swallowing the road behind him. The figures he had faced before were there, but now they were more defined, more real, and all of them were watching him with eyes that glowed with hatred. Mike tried to accelerate, but the truck seemed stuck, moving slower and slower. Desperation overtook him as he watched the darkness approach, but this time he had no way to escape. The shadows began to surround the truck, and he felt the weight of fear, as if the road itself was closing in on him. Then, a voice whispered in his mind, a voice he recognized immediately. "You will never escape us, Mike. The road is part of you now. And it always will be." Mike woke abruptly, his body covered in cold sweat, his heart pounding uncontrollably. He looked around the room, trying to orient himself, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. He knew the road was still there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to reclaim him. He got out of bed, unable to stay lying down. The walls of the room seemed to close in around him, and he felt the need to get out, to breathe fresh air, to remind himself that he was free, that the nightmare was over. He put on a coat and left the room, quickly descending the stairs to the street. The night was cold, and the air was thick, with a light fog beginning to form over the river. Mike walked slowly along the sidewalk, trying to calm his mind. The streets were empty, and the town seemed to be asleep, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking, hidden in the shadows. He stopped at the riverbank, staring at the dark, silent water. The current was gentle but constant, and the sound of the river was almost hypnotic. Mike tried to focus on that sound, to use it as an anchor to keep himself in the present, but his mind kept wandering back to the road, to the horrors he had faced. Then he noticed something in the water. At first, it seemed like just a distorted reflection of the streetlights, but when he looked closer, he saw that it was a shadow. He thought he was imagining things, that his exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind, but the shadow began to move against the current, as if it were alive. Panic began to set in again. He backed away from the edge, feeling his heart race. The shadow in the water seemed to grow, expanding as if it were taking shape. Mike tried to push away the thoughts that the road had found him again, but deep down, he knew the truth. The road had never left him. It had been with him all along, watching, waiting, and now, it was ready to claim him. The shadow in the water began to rise, slowly emerging. What Mike saw next made his blood run cold. It was a figure, an indistinct silhouette, but unmistakable. It rose from the water without a sound, as if the darkness itself had taken form. The figure's eyes glowed, and Mike knew at that moment that the road was not just a place, it was an entity, something alive and aware, something that wouldn't let him go so easily. Without thinking, Mike turned and started running. Fear propelled him forward, but he knew he couldn't run forever. The town streets, which had once seemed so normal, were now distorted, the shadows growing and stretching as if trying to grab him. He ran to the motel, but when he reached the door, he realized that the world around him had changed again. The motel's lights were off, and the building looked deserted, as if it had been abandoned for years. The door he had passed through hours earlier was now locked, and the windows were covered in dust and cobwebs. He tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. Mike backed away, looking around desperately, trying to find a way out. But the streets were empty, and the shadows seemed to be closing in. Darkness was everywhere, pressing in on him, suffocating him, and he knew he had nowhere to run. Then he heard the voice again, the one that had haunted him since he left the road. "You can't escape, Mike. You belong to us. You always have." Mike felt tears stream down his face, but he refused to give up. He had faced the road before, had survived, and now, he needed to find a way to survive again. He knew that the road was playing on his fears, trying to break him, but he wouldn't let it happen. With one last look at the shadowy figure approaching him, Mike made a decision. He wasn't going to run. Not anymore. He was going to face the road, face whatever it was that was chasing him, and this time, he would win. Taking a deep breath, Mike took a step toward the figure. He felt the cold of the darkness around him, but he also felt something else, the determination that had been forged during his fight for survival. He knew the road wanted him to be afraid, wanted him to give up, but he refused to give it that satisfaction. The figure stopped, as if waiting for him. Mike stopped a few feet away, staring into the void where the creature's eyes should have been. "I'm not your prisoner anymore," he said, his voice steady. "I'm free. And I will stay free." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The darkness around him stirred, as if the road was processing his words. And then, something surprising happened. The figure retreated, its form beginning to dissolve, as if Mike's conviction was weakening it. "You may have marked me," Mike continued, feeling his courage grow. "But I'm still the master of my own life. And I will fight for it." The darkness began to retreat, the shadows dissipating, and the figure before him disappeared completely. Mike felt a weight lift off his shoulders, as if he had finally broken free from the road's grasp. He knew the fight wasn't over, that the road might try to reclaim him in the future, but now he had something he didn't have before, the certainty that he could win. The world around him began to return to normal. The motel lights flickered back on, the streets looked familiar again, and the sense of dread that had been chasing him began to fade. Mike took a deep breath, feeling reality settle around him. He knew he would never forget what he had gone through, and that the scars the road had left on him would remain forever. But now, he also knew that he wasn't powerless. He had faced the road, confronted his fears, and emerged victorious. As he walked back to the motel, Mike felt a new determination take hold of him. He knew he would need to keep moving forward, that the road might still be lurking, but he also knew that he could overcome it. He had escaped its darkness, and now, he was ready to face whatever came next. He entered the room, lay down on the bed, and for the first time in a long while, felt a true sense of peace. The road was still there, somewhere deep in his mind, but he had learned to control his fear. And with that, he finally drifted off to sleep, knowing that, no matter what the future held, he was ready to face it. Dawn arrived gently, casting a golden light over the world, dispelling the shadows of the night. For Mike, this dawn held special meaning. It was the first day of the rest of his life, a new beginning after a harrowing and terrifying battle with the road. He woke up in the motel feeling more rested than he had in any other morning since he had left the road behind. There was something different in the air, something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of relief and the possibility of hope. He got out of bed, stretching, feeling his body still sore but lighter. The images of the road, which used to haunt him constantly, now seemed more distant, like a nightmare that was beginning to fade. He knew he would never forget what he had experienced, but now, for the first time, he felt like he could move forward. After taking a hot shower, Mike looked at himself in the mirror. The eyes staring back at him still showed signs of fatigue and the recent struggle, but there was something else there, a spark of determination, a strength he hadn't known he possessed before. He remembered the words he had spoken to the shadowy figure the night before, the declaration that he was free, and he felt that, in some way, it was true. He had freed himself, at least in part, from the road's influence. As he descended to the motel lobby, Mike was greeted by the same receptionist from the night before. The man gave him a friendly nod, and this time, Mike was able to return the gesture with a genuine smile. "Sleep well?" the receptionist asked, as if he knew exactly what that question meant for Mike. "Better than I expected," Mike replied, his voice carrying a genuine sense of relief. He paid for the stay and thanked the man, feeling that this small act of normalcy was an important step in his journey of recovery. Before leaving, Mike decided to take a walk around the small town. He needed to breathe the fresh morning air, feel the sun on his skin, as a reminder that he was alive and that the world was still there, waiting for him. The streets, which had seemed dark and oppressive the night before, were now full of life. The shops were beginning to open their doors, and people were emerging to start their day. It was a common sight, but to Mike, it was something extraordinary. The normalcy he had longed for was within reach. He walked to the town park, where the trees cast long, peaceful shadows over the well-kept lawn. He sat on a bench, watching children play and elderly people walking slowly, enjoying the start of the day. For the first time in a long while, Mike felt a sense of belonging, as if he was reconnecting with the world he had lost. As he watched life around him, his thoughts began to wander to the future. What would he do now? The road had changed his life in a way he couldn't ignore, but it had also given him a new perspective, a new understanding of himself and his strength. He knew he couldn't just go back to the life he had before. He needed something new, something that would give meaning to his experience. Mike thought about his career as a truck driver. It was a job he had loved, but now, the idea of driving long distances scared him. He knew the memories of the road were still too fresh, and that driving might trigger the traumas he was beginning to overcome. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't run away forever. He needed to find a balance, a way to move forward without letting the past control him. After some time reflecting, Mike got up from the bench and walked back to the truck. He decided that the best way to deal with the trauma was to face it head-on, but cautiously. He couldn't return to the highways immediately, but he also couldn't abandon what he loved to do. He would drive, but on shorter routes, in familiar areas, where he could feel safe while rebuilding his confidence. As he got into the truck, Mike felt a wave of conflicting emotions. The vehicle, which had once been his travel companion, now seemed like a reminder of the nightmare he had faced. But he refused to let fear control him. Taking a deep breath, he started the engine and heard the familiar rumble. This time, the sound wasn't threatening, but comforting. It was a sign that he was still in control. He decided to head to a nearby town where he had friends he hadn't seen in years. They were people he trusted, people who could help him reconnect with reality and start anew. The trip would be short, less than an hour, and he knew it would be a good test to see how he handled the road now that he was in a new phase of his life. As he drove, Mike noticed that he was more attuned to his surroundings. The landscapes passing by the window weren't just scenery for him, they were signs that he was making progress, leaving the past behind. He no longer saw shadows moving between the trees, nor did he feel the oppressive presence of the road. There was only the sound of the tires on the asphalt, the breeze blowing gently through the window, and the soft music playing on the radio. It was the sense of normalcy he had longed for. Upon arriving in his destination town, Mike felt a palpable relief. He had managed to complete the trip without incident, without the fear that used to dominate him. He parked the truck in front of his friend's house, a man he had known since school days, and got out, feeling the warm sun on his face. His friend, Jack, came out to greet him, a wide smile on his face. "Mike! It's been so long, man," Jack said, hugging him tightly. There was something comforting in the familiarity of that hug, something that made Mike realize how much he had missed being surrounded by people who truly cared about him. "Good to see you, Jack," Mike replied, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. They spent the afternoon talking, reminiscing about old times, and catching up on life. Jack noticed that there was something different about Mike, a seriousness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, but he didn't press. He knew Mike would share his story when he was ready. As the day turned into night, Mike felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in a long time. Being with Jack and his family, sharing a simple meal and laughing at old jokes, brought him a sense of normalcy and hope that he thought he might never feel again. He realized that the road, while still a part of him, no longer had the power to control his life. Before going to bed that night, Mike stepped outside into the backyard, where the stars shone brightly in the clear sky. He looked up at the vast expanse above, feeling small but at the same time connected to something greater. The road had been a trial, but also a revelation. He had faced his deepest fears and come out stronger on the other side. Now, he was ready to move forward, to build a new life, with the scars as reminders of his strength. Mike knew that the healing process would be long, that there would be difficult days ahead. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had friends, he had his inner strength, and most importantly, he had a new outlook on life. The road had tried to break him, but it had failed. And now, he was ready to face whatever the future had in store. With one last look at the stars, Mike went back inside Jack's house, finally feeling at peace. He knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was prepared. The road was part of his past, but it wouldn't define his future. And with that, he finally fell asleep, knowing that no matter what happened, he was in control of his own life.